Alright, so in today's lesson of Learning C, we're going to take a look at a concept that we've kind of been interacting with for a little bit, but haven't really looked at the details behind. We're going to look at two really structural elements of the C language, and these are more related to organization rather than they are actual programming features, but we're going to use them to organize our code. So first we're going to look at how we create the header files that we've been using. So as you know, throughout the applications that we've been writing, we've been including code that's been located in header files from other places. We've been basically importing functions, so to speak, from other places, and we've been able to use those functions. And so we're going to look at how we can write a header file and use it in our program when we compile it so that we can get some code from an external file if we want to organize our program in that way. So first, let's create a new basic program. So we've been looking at including headers that are part of the C standard library, basically headers that are a standard part of C programming, like the standard library, stdio.h, headers like this. So we're going to first look at how we actually include our own header, and the syntax looks a little bit different than we're used to. Since we're including a header that's not part of the standard library, the include directive, or the include preprocessor directive, is going to look like this. We're going to include a header from the local directory instead of something from the standard library, so we're going to use quotes in this instance. And that's all the code we're going to write in this file for now. So from here we can go and take a look at the header that we're going to write. So we're going to create a new file called myheader.h, just like we specified within the quotes in our C main application. And here we're going to write the actual function that we want to call. So we're going to write a really small function that computes the factorial of a number. So then we're going to actually print it out to the screen. So we can actually include files just like we would anywhere else, like in our main application, and we can write functions, but there's no main loop here, or there's basically no main entry point. You can't really compile a header file directly by itself. So the code that we write here has to be accessible from another file if we want to use it. So we're going to write a function that we'll then be able to call in our main function. So let's write that function. So the basic formula that we're going to use with this calculation isn't really important, but it looks something like this. And then we can print out the result like this. So that's basically it. The code that we write in our header file here can then be accessed from our main program and run. So after we save this program, we can go back to our main file and simply leverage this function with a particular input. So now we've moved back to our main application where we can call the print factorial function that we've just written, and we can basically use it like it's in our main file. There's no difference for it being in the header file. And so that's basically all we have to do to leverage our function, so we should be able to make and run this program. And we get the factorial output of our number. So that's basically how we can use header files to include code that we've written, much like we've been using code from the standard library, functions from predefined C files. We can create our own header files and include basically whatever code that we want in them. And then we can use those functions in our main program. So that's the basics of how we can use header files to include other code inside our main program. So the other thing that we're going to look at in this lesson is preprocessor directives, and we're going to look at just a few of the basic concepts and things that you can do with some of the preprocessor directives. So let's go back into our program for a second. So right now, the only preprocessor directive that we've really been able to take a look at is include. And what include does is it just pulls some code in from another file like we've been using it for. But there's a couple other preprocessor directives, and we're going to talk about one specific one in this lesson called define. The define preprocessor directive allows us to set what is known as a macro in C. And we can actually define them in header files and use them in our main program. We can also define them in our same main program file. But let's take a look at how they're used so we can get a better idea of how we can use macros. So the define preprocessor directive basically allows us to set up statements that kind of get evaluated by the preprocessor. And we can kind of use one of these in a way that's similar to variables. So we can define something like this. So this basically defines something that's really similar to a variable that we can use throughout the course of our program. So this is defined by the preprocessor, and it'll basically replace every instance of this particular name that we specify with what we set as the value of it. So basically we can print out this value now by specifying test var like we set. And essentially when we define a macro like this, we have something that works kind of like a variable that we can print out, and we can't really manipulate it in the same way that we can manipulate variables. We can't really change the value dynamically in the same way, but it's defined by the preprocessor, so that gives us some advantages. If we kind of want to have some things that'll be constant without our program, we can use the define macro, or rather use the define preprocessor directive to create constants like this. So we can run this code and make sure it does what it's supposed to do. As you can see, the value that we specified and defined with the preprocessor directive was printed out. And so this is just a really small example of how we can define macros. They can get a lot more complex. Here we just define something as a simple value, but we can actually define functions as macros if we want them to. If there's pieces of code that you want to define in this way, you can do that. But the general use case for them is things like values that will be constant throughout the execution of your program. And you can keep these in header files as well, and they'll carry over to your main. So the last thing that we're going to look at is there's actually some predefined built-in macros that we can access that give us some basic information. So let's take a look at how we can print things like that out. So really quickly, the two built-in macros that we can access are, we can actually use a built-in macro that's built into C to figure out what file we're in. So this might be pretty useful if you want to write code that manipulates or looks at other code. You can access a macro to look at what file you're in, and that's built in to C. And we can use that like this. And the other macro that we're going to take a look at is we also have access to the current date, which we might want for use in our program, and it's another built-in preprocessor macro that we can use. So, and we can access it in a similar way, _date. So we can print these out and run to get a sense of how they work. So as you can see, the name of the file that we were in when that code was executing gets printed out, program10.c, and then we actually get the current date printed out to the screen according to our computer time. So these are some built-in macros that we can sort of use to get a sense of how macros work, and we can use these as values anywhere we need to in our system. We can compare against them. We can't assign to them, but we can use them to get information like this in the various places in our program that we're going to need it. So that's kind of an overview of header files and some basic preprocessor directives in C. So in the future lessons, we're going to be looking at some more complicated things you can do with the preprocessor directives. You can add conditions in there and some things like that. So that's it for this lesson.